This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, helping you to navigate your private practice journey. This is session number 103 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm Gordon Brewer, and I'm so glad you've tuned into the podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome. Glad you found us. Glad you're listening in. If you're coming back for more, glad to have you back. I'm glad you're following the podcast, and hopefully you subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. You know, this is a little bit different episode, and for those of you that are regular listeners, you might have noticed that this one's coming out a little bit later than I normally do. Normally, I like to have the podcast episode to come out on Monday morning, but this one's coming out later in the week. And part of it is just because I ran into a time crunch. This past week, I think I shared in the previous episode that I took off and went out to Colorado and went to the Killin'It Camp, a big event that was sponsored by Joe Sanok over at the Practice of the Practice, and boy, was it a blast. And so one of the things that it's one of those experiences where it's just kind of one of those kind of mountaintop pivotal kind of experiences where you really get to connect with people and really learn about private practice and being able to learn from others and hear about other people's stories and experiences. And I made so many new friends and so many great connections with that. So I thought in this episode, I really got to talk about that and just kind of tell a little bit about my presentation and just kind of the backstory behind that. But also give my thoughts on just why it's important to connect and just being able to make those connections. So I'm going to get to that here in a minute. You're going to hear me talk in this episode a little bit about a new thing that I've come out with, or new thing, or a revamp of an older thing, and that's the Session Note Helper. One of the things that I've developed using the tools of Google GSuite, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I happened on all of this, was to put together a way to create or write session notes that just cuts the time in half, if not more so. With the Session Note Helper, you use a Google form to be able to check off boxes of what you did in the session and the interventions you used and the things you talked about and all of that sort of thing. And you fill out that form online, you click Submit, and it produces a narrative in a Google Doc format. And it's just a huge time saver, and you can customize it to your own needs. But you can check that out over at sessionnotehelper.com. I just have the URL, sessionnotehelper.com, and you can find out more about that. I'm real excited about it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here later in the episode, just about the reaction people had to that when I introduced it to them at the conference. And it's one of those situations where I think for all of us, and we probably experience this with clients, where we have information, we have a set of skills or a set of knowledge or a knowledge base that we kind of take for granted. In other words, there's stuff that we know that we don't realize other people don't know. And so it's it was one of those things, and it was a big aha for me just around the whole Google G Suite thing at this conference. And it was just kind of like I was, just a huge aha. I just took for granted that everyone knew about Google G Suite, which when I say Google G Suite, what I'm talking about is the set of tools that you get with a Google account. So if you have a regular, just free Gmail account, you've got access to these tools like Google Docs, Google Drive, Google Sheets, Google Forms, those sorts of things. But there's a way to set that up to be HIPAA secure if you use the paid version of Google G Suite, which is, it's absolutely a great return on the investment. So anyway, you can check that out over at either go to practiceoftherapy.com/GSuite, and that will get you to the course that I did on that, or you can go to sessionnotehelper.com and get the session note progress note templates that I put together, and it'll explain a little more about that. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be talking about in this particular episode, and just as I mentioned already, just the importance of connecting. So let's switch gears here and talk about G Suite and connecting. This morning when I was out walking, which is kind of my morning routine here lately, I get out and walk in the mornings, and it's such a gorgeous time of year to do that with all the leaves changing and that sort of thing. But I was listening to a podcast that is one of my regular podcasts, and you've heard me speak about it before here on this podcast, and that's Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income. And one of the particular episode, they were talking about going to events or going to conferences and that sort of thing. And it really, it was good timing in that I happened to hear that this morning, because I was also reflecting on this past week. As I mentioned earlier in the intro, this episode, I really want to kind of share with you two things. One is just about Google G Suite and the presentation I did at the conference on that, but also just the value of connecting with people. And it's they seem kind of disconnected, but to me, there's a story there, and I felt like I needed to tell the story. So, one of the things about going to conferences, I think a lot of people have kind of fall into one of two camps. Either they dread going, but they go because they need continuing education hours or something along those lines, or they're those people that just really get energized by conferences and learning new stuff. And I've always enjoyed going to conferences, I guess, because it's a way to kind of get out and go to new places and go to new cities and just connect with people and meet new people and that sort of thing, which sounds kind of strange for me since I'm basically wired as an introvert, so that seems a little strange. But I do love connecting with people, and I do love hearing people's stories and hearing, just learning from people in that sense. But one of the things that I realized I had kind of taken for granted was when I launched this whole G Suite thing. Let me tell you a little bit of the backstory with this. So several years ago, when I was really making that transition from part-time private practice into more full-time private practice, one of the things I was trying to figure out how to do was to use the URL for my website, which was kingsportcounseling.com, use that URL for my email. So it's lgordonbrewer@kingsportcounseling.com rather than at gmail.com or at yahoo.com or whatever email provider you're using. Just felt like it was going to give a little more of a professional edge. So the other thing that I needed to be able to do, I'm sure, is to make all of that HIPAA secure, because there was a lot of press at that time about HIPAA, and it was just really kind of getting started when the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Most of us forget what HIPAA stands for, because we tend to think of HIPAA is just kind of this big brother kind of thing out there that's going to slap us on the hand if we don't use our electronics correctly. And one of the things I talked about when I did the presentation was just about HIPAA anxiety and just being able to not get too worked up about that. So anyway, with the story about how I kind of landed on G Suite, I was looking for a way to send email that was HIPAA secure. And one of the things that HIPAA requires is that you have with any provider of services or vendors or whatever that you have, where you're going to be using personal health information from your clients in that context, you have to have from them what is called a BAA, a business associate agreement. And so it's kind of like an agreement between you and that particular company about how they're going to handle the information that you give them to store or give them to transmit. And so that's one of the big pieces that you have to have with HIPAA is that BAA. So lo and behold, as I started researching it, I realized that the BAA, you could get that from Google. But the crux of it is that you have to get the paid version of Google. And at that time, it was called Google GSuite for Work or Google for Work. That they later changed the name to just GSuite for Business. But it's a subscription that you get from Google. And the thing about it is it's very economical. I mean, it's really cheap. And so I started looking into that and trying to understand that. And my friend Roy Huggins, some of his stuff over at Person Centered Tech helped me with all of that. And so the long story short was, as I started using Google G Suite for my email. And so I was able to get not only the BAA from them, but also they allow you, when you get their paid version, to use the URL of your business, of your website. So I signed up for it. And it's only at that time it was only $5 a month, but now they've gone up a whole $1. It's $6 a month for the basic version, and then $12 a month for the business version. And the big difference is the storage that you have. But anyway, so I started playing around with all of that. And I had just assumed that maybe people knew about Google G Suite and about Gmail and all of that, because Gmail is probably the largest email provider in the world by now. But and so a lot of people are familiar with Gmail. But the other thing that you get when you get a Google account, whether it's the free Gmail account or the paid more premium version of that, is you get a whole suite of tools on the back end of that. So you get like the use of Google Docs, you get the use of Google Sheets, Google Drive, Google Forms, all those different tools that maybe you've used in school or maybe you've used at different times. But I think sometimes people forget about the fact that those are really powerful tools to use in your practice. So as I started playing around with all of that, I was really got interested in creating templates with my work, because I realized that there's a lot of stuff that I do that's just kind of writing the same things over and over again. And so in particular, I started thinking about my progress notes and session notes. I noticed that when I was writing those out, typing those out, I would use essentially the same phrasing in those notes, because I had a template that I was using. It's a style of note called, it was just a style of note that I had kind of adapted, from either we're familiar with a SOAP note or a DAP note. But I had just kind of created my own template for that. And so one of the things I noticed is as I would write those notes, I would write them essentially the same way every time. And so I thought there's got to be a way to be able to do this so that for each individual client, I could create a note just by going through and hitting some checkboxes on a Google form, and it create a narrative. So I started tinkering around with that and came up with what is I refer to now as the session note helpers system. The problem is that when I started using it, I found an add-on that within Google within Google Docs and Google Forms that I could use. It's called Form Publisher. And so I started using that, and it actually worked. It would created a form where you just go through and check off what you did in a session with someone and the issues they were having and all of that. And I would check it all off, and then I'd hit submit, and it would produce a narrative in a Google Doc format. And so that was just a huge time saver for me. With that system and how I kind of perfected it, I was able to get my session notes writing down to, I could probably write, using that system, write a typical session note in 5 minutes or less. And so it's just a huge time saver and a huge way to do that. And then if I needed to edit that document in any way, I could do that directly in the document. So it was a huge time saver. And so I thought, okay, other people might be interested in this. And so I started putting out there, I got the URL Session Note Helper, and started just kind of marketing this system, which is a set. You get a set of templates with it, and then just the instructions on how to set it all up. Well, the problem was with Form Publisher, that add-on, it wasn't exactly HIPAA secure, because since it was a third-party application, I couldn't, that particular company wouldn't provide the BAA that you need. So, and plus they were running into some problems with Google. Just about Google wasn't really keen on how they were using data and that sort of thing. I researched it a lot, and from what they wrote in their documentation, it wasn't that any personal health information was at risk, other than the fact that they just weren't saying that we're going to kind of guarantee that we're not going to lose this information, or it's not going to be used for something else. So anyway, fast forward, I thought, well, this is a good system, but I hate not to use it, hate not to have other people use it. So I went ahead and hired what is called an app script developer. And so these are people that are experts in being able to write the programming on the back end of Google applications. And Google makes that possible. So I know this is really techie kind of stuff. But anyway, so I came up with a new version of the Session Note Helper, which I'm calling Session Note Helper 2.5. And you'll see links in the show notes for how you can get access to that and get the template. And so when I went to the Killin'It Camp conference, I had just gotten through working with the developer on this, and I thought, well, I'll see if people are interested in that. I thought, there might be one or two people that are interested in this, and I kind of demonstrated it during the talk and talked about it and just about how you can use all the other tools of Google G Suite. And what I was blown away by was the fact that people were so excited about it. And I was maybe kind of minimizing the impact that this could have for people. So anyway, for those of you that don't know, I do have a course, G Suite for Therapists. I'm going to be doing some updates to it, but it's available on the website, practiceoftherapy.com and /G Suite, and you can get access to the course. And also you can go to sessionnotehelper.com and get access to the Session Note Helper. But those the Session Note Helper works with using the tools of G Suite. So hopefully that's not too confusing for people. But anyway, I wanted people to know about that. And when I started letting people know about it, I had one of those aha moments where I realized that, okay, I know stuff that maybe other people don't know, and I've kind of taken that for granted. So anyway, want you to know about that. And I was so excited to get all the questions that I did, and just all the people that were curious about it. And what it did, and this is just kind of a good segue into kind of this next part here. What it did is it helped me create some connections with people in a genuine way. One of the things that I love being able to do is help people in their private practices. And when people saw that there were shortcuts that they were not aware of. It was just, in many ways, just kind of life-changing for them. And the other thing that I think going to a conference does is it really helps you kind of forge much more meaningful conversations and meaningful relationships. I know that probably the most valuable time for me at the whole conference was being able to sit around a table, having a meal together, and just talking about our practices, and people talking about, well, I do this and I do that, and being able to share that. And I just got so much information from that. The other thing that was great about going to a conference like that is to be able to just connect with people that you maybe have kind of lost touch with. There is just a whole group of people that I've really enjoyed getting to know and love, and those are some of the other private practice consultants that are out there. There was Katie Englert from Practicat, and there was Jessica Tepana from is another private practice consultant. Whitney Owens, who Whitney is really starting some neat stuff around faith and practice, and working with Joe Sanok on doing some consulting around all of that. And it was just so great to catch up with Whitney and be able to talk about those kinds of things, and really learning kind of her approach to that. I've had Whitney's been on the podcast a couple of times before, in this last podcast episode, and I can't remember the number, but we'll have it here in the show notes, where she talked about doing kind of a faith-based practice. And I think for a lot of our clients, that is something that is appealing to them and something that they're looking for, because I think the spiritual side of life certainly affects the emotional side of life. And so great conversations just around all of those issues, and how people are doing those types of practices out there. So I was just so excited to be at the Killin'It Camp, and just all the connections I made some new friends, and I'm looking forward to having them on the podcast. Again, I've got another one is Allison Pigeon. She's a consultant working with Joe. Also Amanda Patterson, and Amanda was the one thing I'll say about Amanda is she showed me how to finally use Instagram correctly. So just showing my age a little bit, I tried to get my daughter to kind of teach me some of those things, but she just kind of rolled her eyes at me. So I kind of backed off on that. So, but anyway, my point is with all of this is, do take the time to connect with others in your community, whether it's through your state organizations, whether it be through social work or professional counselors, or through marriage and family therapists. I think whenever we get together in those contexts, it really gives us so much room for growth. You know, another thing I'll mention here that I did, which I'm glad I did, is when I was flying back, I just spent time while I was on the plane just kind of doing some journaling and writing down kind of the things that stood out for me about the conference, and about what I learned, and just kind of some ideas that I came up with. And I think that's another part of private practice growth. Is just being able to spend time processing what you learn and being able to write things out. And I'm not talking about just tapping a note in your phone. I'm just talking about literally writing things out. I think it has a way for our brain to kind of process things in a different way. So I would encourage you to do that. So, so those are my ramblings on GSuite and making connections. This is a little different episode, but I wanted to be sure and get it out while I had it on my mind. And again, apologize for this episode coming out a little later, but just that's the way things rolled this week when I was putting all this together. So love to hear back from you. Love to hear your thoughts. Connect with me on social media. Also, you can shoot me an email. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of this. And if you have questions about G Suite or the course or anything like that, and the session note helper that I talked about, please reach out to me for all of that. Well, I hope this episode hadn't been too far off track or too different than the normal episode. Again, I've got some great guests lined up for some future episodes, people that I met at the conference, and I'm excited for you to get to know them. And some repeat guests from previous episodes are going to be coming back on. And so I'm just so excited about that, and just being able to connect with people in that way. That's the whole reason I do this podcast, is I get to talk to some really cool people. But one thing I'll mention that I failed to mention in just talking about the session note helper. The session note helper doesn't replace your electronic health record system. It's not really doesn't replace that kind of a system. In fact, I use it in conjunction, and GSuite doesn't really replace an electronic health record system. I still use it in conjunction with TherapyNotes, which is the electronic health record system that I recommend and that I use in my own practice. Again, they're a sponsor of the podcast, and I'm really grateful to them for that. But again, reach out to me if you have questions about G Suite or want to know more. I'm really realizing that this is a tool that people can use in their practice in many different ways. And so I just want to make sure you're aware of it. And do check out the whole course that I did on this. It's G Suite for Therapists. And you can get to that at practiceoftherapy.com/G Suite. Also, be sure and check out today's sponsor for the podcast, TherapyNotes. And you can get to them at therapynotes.com. And if you will give them the coupon code Gordon, just GORDON, when you check out, you can get 2 months free of their services. It's a great deal. They handle everything from scheduling to insurance claims. All of that is just all in one package, and it's just really kind of one of the big hubs of my practice, and I can't do without it. So be sure and check them out. So that's it for this episode, folks. A little bit shorter episode than we normally do, but that's okay. Hopefully this is helpful information to you. And be sure and come back and subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. And hopefully you're going to be here with me in this journey for quite a while. I plan on doing this for a while. So take care, folks. Have a good rest of your week and weekend whenever you might be listening to the podcast. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.